Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our next session on the annual Dialogue Summit for 2022. This is a roundtable discussion number 3 on day 2, and we're going to be talking about what's happening in the Oceania region and in the Pacific. And I think we couldn't be more central of the Pacific than the French Polynesia and Hawaii. So I'm delighted to be joined this morning, Hong Kong time. I think it's afternoon or early evening, wherever you are, on Tuesday. So I always get confused with all the different time zones that we're dealing with in this summit, but it's fantastic to be connected by these digital means these days. But I do hope that we will meet in person under the year of the USA chairing APEC in 2023. And they just took over a few days ago. And looking forward to all of the exciting events that are already being announced, such as the one coming up, which I think Celeste will talk about a bit later, the informal senior official meetings that's going to be held in Hawaii in early December. And we're excited that San Francisco, the host city for APEC next year in November, will be inviting and seeing hundreds of CEOs coming in from all over Asia Pacific in person. And we also got Vincent Dropsy, who's joining us from, and I'm just checking. Tahiti, yeah, sorry. I'm just moving Danny in because Danny's joining us as well. Just give that a second. Okay. So Danny will be joining us, and that's fantastic. Vincent, yeah, great to see you. So you're with the French Polynesia University, or University of French Polynesia, and also that's with the French Polynesia Islands PEC chapter to the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, which of course PBEC is also a institutional member of, and I sit on the standing committee. So it's fantastic to see you, Vincent, and highly recommended from our French colleagues in Paris because they said you're the expert. So, Danny, I don't know if you can hear us, Danny. You're on, oh, here we go. Danny, I know you're in an airport somewhere in America, so I don't know if you can show your video or not. If you can't, don't worry, but it's great that you can join us. And because of time, I'm concerned that you have to jump on a plane. And we can hear your plane announcement in the background. If you can't speak, just send something in the chat.
No, I'm good to speak, Michael. You'll just hear some announcements in the background from time to time.
Okay,
but it's so Thanksgiving travel time, so it's a bit a bit hectic.
So why don't we do this, Danny? Why don't you go first, do a brief introduction about yourself and share a few things, and then if you have to drop off, we'll continue with Vincent and Celeste. So go ahead, Danny. You've got the floor.
Oh, got it. Thank you. Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone. It's great to be with you. So my name is Danny Burrows. I'm the founder and director of Tradeworthy, which is a consultancy in the space of trade and investment and digital trade. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We do work mainly in the ASEAN region and also, of course, in the Pacific. So look, we've got a very broad brief here today, Michael. And so I've sort of been trying to sort of tease out what kind of insightful comments I can bring to the discussion. And so I've kind of landed on three areas. The first is kind of comments about what we're seeing in trade and investment at a regional level. The second is a snapshot of a key growth sector for the Pacific, and that's going to be e-commerce, just to preface my comments there, digital trade. And then the third is a kind of interesting new issue for the region, something to consider when we talk about what the region actually is, so how to define itself. So it'll kind of go between broad macroeconomic issues all the way through down to sort of the microeconomic. And I guess the big picture on trade and investment is really that the numbers remain quite uniquely troubling, actually, for the COVID recovery period, particularly for the Pacific Island small states, which is essentially the Pacific Island states ex-PNG. So PNG being the sort of largest population. So what we see there is goods and services exports from those states have fallen significantly from the highs of the late 2010s, which was around about $4 to $5 billion in exports per year, to just over $2 billion today. So that's a a very dramatic drop. And the COVID effects, especially in the tourism sector, are not bouncing back as quickly as we're seeing in other regions. So there's something uniquely going on in the Pacific where we're not having that return back to, I wouldn't say the good old days, but at least somewhat approaching the pre-pandemic levels. And it's a similar picture in FDI, foreign direct investment, which is today around a third to a half less than FDI than from the pre-pandemic period. So again, around that sort of 500 to 600 million range to around about 300 million per annum today, sort of in a quote unquote post-pandemic period. So the statistics bear out a troubling picture. The Pacific is not rebounding to the same levels as other regions. And I compare the Caribbean and of course compare developed regions like Europe and the States or North America. So something's going on. In terms of policy responses to this, what are the big regions, the key regions doing about these types of issues? Well, for better or for worse, this concept of the blue Pacific economy, which I'm sure would be discussed around many of the tables and discussions of those at this discussion here today, the blue Pacific economy does remain the driving force behind policy development and policy responses. And broadly, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but this is essentially around the sustainable use of ocean resources, especially fisheries and tourism. And that's kind of morphed in, let's say, the last 5 or so years into a stronger focus on climate change and climate adaptation, mitigation, etc. But it raises quite a number of key, both academic and practical challenges when people refer to this idea of the blue economy as the sort of unifying strategy of how the world should respond to development challenges in the Pacific. You know, firstly, is there an emphasis in this blue Pacific economy idea of growth over equity and sharing of resources? So is everything focused on growth, which is a relatively older style of development thinking? Is the blue Pacific economy merely a political tool? You can Google some wonderful papers on this, whether it's been used for practical application or merely just as a sort of a term to unify people behind a particular measure. And the other development, I think, which is really interesting, is that there's an increasing recognition of the role that regional strategy plays. Excuse the announcement. Just bear with me. Okay, so how we knit together the regional strategy and national action. So we work in a number of different regions, and we don't see as strong a theme about that kind of regional collective opportunity and then how it ties into national action. It's a very strong theme in the Pacific. And you can see it in examples like the PACER Plus agreement, which is the Pacific, a number of Pacific states plus Australia and New Zealand trade agreement, which was recently sort of renegotiated and concluded. And what we're seeing here is a very strong emphasis on the economic cooperation at the regional level. So how can all of the states come together around common policy challenges? And I won't go on about it, but also the US re-engagement, the US Pacific Partnership Strategy, which has just been announced and is all about trying to knit together the various aspects of development. So I'll take the example of e-commerce. We're seeing a renewed investment in the hardware, the investment, the technology, but then also what they call the enabling environment. So we're seeing investment in, pause again. Okay, so we're seeing a focus on everything from the submarine cables, that's the hardware, to private sector development, moving businesses actually online, then the trade facilitation at both the global level, but also particularly in the Pacific, and then on national laws for consumer protection and cybersecurity. So there's a sort of beginning or nose to tail approach to this kind of blue Pacific economy. If I have a little time, I just want to talk about e-commerce, which is a sector very close to our heart at Tradeworthy. We've done a lot of work in this sector. And e-commerce or digital trade is emerging as really a key enabler, both at the domestic level and for international cross-border trade. And I would say especially food, grocery and small items, we're seeing an explosion, of course, during COVID, but it has sustained, that explosion in activity has been sustained since COVID. And this is particularly driven by social commerce. So that is kind of informal sellers selling informally through the social media channels, Facebook and Instagram and those types of things. But also, it's in terms of regional trade and even extra regional trade, we're seeing as e-commerce as a very much a diffusing tool. So especially in the sector of tourism. So you ask yourself, how do you reserve a hotel room in Samoa? How do you book a car in Tonga? How do you hire a tour guide in the Cook Islands or your dive in Fiji? These are increasingly now being enabled internationally, so cross-border, through e-commerce channels, but not all Pacific states are created equal. So they don't have all access to the tools that one needs to benefit from these. And in particular, and this is probably the biggest single opportunity for those who are entrepreneurial minded, is around payments, and particularly integration of payment gateways, the allowance of accepting payments online and then settling those payments through payments to the provider. Many jurisdictions in the Pacific don't have card issuers. Many banks in the region haven't made the investment required to offer low-cost payment services to e-retailers. And that, they say, is due to the expectation of kind of low value or low volume transactions. So it's an understandable decision, but it creates a very significant opportunity for the fintechs if we can get the regulatory picture right. This is probably the single biggest driver of potential e-commerce growth in the region, but it's a tough nut to crack. And I'd urge people who are interested to download the PIF's, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat e-commerce regional strategy and roadmap, which we're Tradeworthy supported, but it identifies 54 specific costed measures to be implemented by 2025 across 7 areas of the digital economy. Every one of these measures is looking for a partner, looking for an opportunity to drive it forward. So, Michael, if you can, I'll just have one more comment around Timor Leste, and that is, we see this as a really interesting emerging opportunity for the bridge between Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So, the nuts and bolts of it are Timor Leste has 1.3 million people sitting right at the geographic crossroads of the Pacific and Asia. It's increasingly active as a member of the Pacific regional structure and integration. For example, they've agreed to participate in the EU's Pacific Economic Partnership Agreement, so as a member of the Pacific region, but it's also been since 2011 trying to join the ASEAN grouping. And in fact, at the recent summit in Cambodia, it was just given a pathway to join ASEAN. So what is Timor Leste? Is it in the Pacific? Is it in ASEAN? What development path will they choose to follow? And are there complementarities in the economies of the Pacific and of Southeast Asia that Timor Leste is well placed to tap into? It's a big question. It's an important question, I think, for the Pacific. Again, 1.3 million people in the context of the Pacific is not small. So this is a real opportunity, an area of potential synergy. So with that, and apologies again for the background noise, I'll hand it back to you, Michael, for any thought. And I can hang on for a little while if that's all right.
Thank you, Danny. That was wonderful. I mean, so much to digest there. I've been writing busily there. Thank you so much. I will now ask Vincent, if Vincent is available. I don't know if you were listening in on some of those comments, but from Danny, it was fascinating. In some ways, gave a good scene setter for a lot of the topics that we'll hopefully have a chance to discuss amongst the three of us. But what I would suggest, Vincent, why don't you give us your backdrop on specifically the French Polynesia, another island in the Pacific, which our members would love to hear what's going on. So over to you, Vincent.
Thank you very much, Michael. I was very interested in what Danny said, because actually in French Polynesia, because of its institutional ties to France, it's quite different, as you can see. I'm going to go over very quickly the latest economic, trade and tourism condition, but I'm going to focus also at the end on the vulnerabilities and especially on the new sustainable and inclusive tourism strategy, which might help to solve some of the problems that we observe. First of all, not only in 2020, but in 2008, the French Polynesian economy suffered a lot from the crisis. You can see on the left-hand side graph that actually took almost 10 years to come back to a level of GDP as we knew in 2007. And of course, there's tremendous uncertainty about the rebound. Will the rebound will be as long, as short as in other countries? We don't know yet. On the right-hand side graph, you can see the employment numbers, basically. So of course, we had a collapse of unemployment, especially in the tourism sector. But the good news is that tourism has rebounded quite strongly in 2022. Now, one important aspect of the French Polynesian economy is actually its tremendous help, assistance from the French state. The French state basically gives about quarter of GDP, subsidies equivalent to quarter of GDP in French Polynesia, but still doesn't help to recover as fast. So what are the latest trade conditions? Well, for decades and decades, we have had a huge trade imbalances, about 1/3 of GDP, and most of it is financed, as I said, by French subsidies. But of course, in 2020, there was a collapse of tourism and a collapse of trade, in particular exports, that you can see on the right-hand side graph. Now, in terms of tourism, as you can see on the left-hand side graph, unfortunately, we have known a lot of erratic fluctuations. We topped 250,000 tourists in 2020, in 2000, and we still never got back to that record, even in 2019, 20 years later. So the right-hand side graphs illustrates that lack of competitiveness, in a sense that if you look at the blue line, which is going down, this is basically the trend for international tourist arrivals in French Polynesia, whereas the other lines that are going up are the ones of the Asia-Pacific region of the world. So clearly there's an internal problem of competitiveness for French Polynesia. Of course, I'm not going to go over all the details, but you have heard, I'm sure all of you, of the World Bank's 3D challenge. The fact is that we have very few economies of scale for a small economy. So the problem of density, higher cost of production, and of reduced competitiveness. There's a problem of distance. We're in the middle of course, the South Pacific, very far away, which of course means higher transportation costs, not only for goods, but also for people, for tourism. And finally, we have internal divisions. We are very spread out, the size of Europe and for French Polynesian islands. But also we have a very protectionist policy, which of course increased the cost of production. And as a result, well, we have less exports of goods and services, tourism in particular, and lower standard of living, lower economic growth. That's a long-term issue. But in the short term, that's a good news. If you look at this graph, which was provided me by the government a few weeks ago, it seems that actually we're coming back quite strong in terms of tourist arrival. We probably will be back to 2017 levels. That's the good news. The bad news is actually most of those tourists come from essentially America and from France. So there's a lack of diversification. So in particular, let me very quickly go over some short-term issues and vulnerability in tourism. Of course, we all heard about revenge travel after the COVID period, but it seems that maybe this revenge travel might disappear in 2023. We're all concerned, of course, with higher prices, higher airfares, higher tourism prices. And nobody knows exactly if the inflation will be sustained or not next year and the next few years. That's a big question for economists like me. Third, we've all heard and we fear the probability of a recession in 2023, which of course might affect tourism. But in particular case of French Polynesia, basically, the fact that some markets in Asia might be closed means that, of course, there's a lack of diversification. As I said, about 50% of the tourists come from America and about 1/3 from France. And this is a little bit against this new strategy to diversify tourism in order to be, of course, more resilient. And finally, we have problems of air connections in the sense that we talked about recently with airline companies, local airline companies, international airline companies, and hotels, owner, CEOs. And the hotels said, well, we want more planes, we want more connection through Asia. And the airlines reply, yes, but the hotels are closed. So we're not going to open your line until the hotels are open. So there's a little bit of chicken and egg syndrome here in French Polynesia. We'll see if it's easy or not to solve that. To conclude, basically, there are long-term issues in tourism. So there was a 2-year plan, basically, to co-construct a strategy based on sustainable and inclusive tourism. And that strategy basically has the following objectives. One, diversify and develop tourism offer. Try to have more uniqueness, innovations, and focusing on culture. Two, commit to sustainable tourism and actually be a leader, the reference in the Pacific islands. Three, create, of course, more jobs, not just jobs in Tahiti, Bora Bora, but all over the islands, the 60 islands that are inhabited, which is quite a challenge. Four, diversify the source of the tourist flow, as I pointed out. Most of them come from America or from France. And so we expect basically more authentic tourism, more professional services, and to be a leader, as I said, in ecotourism, as well as a variety of experiences and archipelagos. Okay, I stop here because my 5 minutes are over. Thank you very much, Michael.
And thank you, Vincent. Yeah, wonderful overlay of what's going on there. Lots to digest and cover. But I think the theme there is, it's challenging, but we hope with France's support that things will improve. And you mentioned before we came online that President Macron will probably visit in November next year, if not before, maybe on his way to APEC to have a big summit on the island. So we look forward to hearing more on the lead up to that, because there'll be lots to talk about and build up to his visit. Over now to Hawaii and Celeste. Great to see you again, Celeste. We were talking just a few days ago on many subjects that you're doing fantastic things on initiatives in Hawaii. But why don't you quickly introduce yourself and take your few minutes to do an overview of what you're doing in Hawaii. Thank you so much. Over to you, Celeste.
So aloha, Michael and Vincent and Danny. It's delightful to be on the panel with you. And I think it's quite nice to hear your perspectives and actually further localize this on some level and then go back global again. So Celeste Connors, I'm the CEO of Hawaii Green Growth. We're a UN Local 2030 hub. And in fact, on the eve of the APEC with US leadership, it's great to recount that we are actually an APEC legacy commitment and to see that ongoing collaboration. I should also note we are an island economy. So things that Vincent talked about how island economies are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of COVID, how we've been managing that COVID recovery, and some of the same insights I think that Vincent has shared. But just going back to the beginning of the slide here, is where Hawaii Green Growth is a public-private partnership of over 150 individuals and institutions that have come together across private sector, civil society, and government. And we were actually launched, as I mentioned, during the US-hosted APEC Summit in Honolulu in 2011. And interestingly, at that time, it's worth recalling that we were emerging from the 2008 financial crisis. And in fact, Hawaii Green Growth as a network was inspired by the Green Growth Report that OECD devised after the 2008 financial crisis adopted by OECD economies. And I think that was certainly an inspiration for the US APEC leadership year. Green Growth then was actually inspired a group of local leaders to come together, including now Senator Schatz, to launch Hawaii Green Growth, how Hawaii can get on a sustainable pathway. And so what we do as an organization, and I will connect this back to what we heard Vincent and Danny talk about, the bigger picture of the blue economy and the need for local regional governments to align, is as a partnership, we convene our stakeholders through a series of meetings and working groups. We actually have set a high-level political commitment to achieve 6 priority goals by the year 2030. And these actually align with the Global Sustainable Development Goals. What we also do is then we measure our progress in an open and transparent way through an online dashboard, our data dashboard, and then we focus on implementation and action. I think if we go to the next slide, you'll see a snapshot of the dashboard. And then I'll go back to this slide in just a minute. So the dashboard is really interesting. It's an Esri-based geospatial mapping dashboard. If I go to the next slide so you can see this, sorry, I'm doing my slide. I think we have a slide of the dashboard in there somewhere in the deck. Okay, well, in any case, the open data dashboard, and we'll put this into the chat, actually tracks progress across all 6 of our goals, and that rolls up to the SDGs. One of the things that we were able to do is, as a result of the COVID disruption as an island economy, Hawaii went from having one of the lowest unemployment rates to nearly the highest unemployment rate in the country as a result of the disruption to our tourism economy. And Vincent noted that as well. And so what we actually were asked to do by our partners is, as the COVID recovery funding was imminent and coming, is to do a green jobs survey. So we were able to poll our partners from across the state to actually identify over 10,000 jobs at about $535 million that were actually open right now for employment should money come available. And these are things like our local food companies that are actually sourcing local food, that are providing local food to our hotels and our businesses. And what we also found is our businesses served almost as anchor institutions during this period. Anchor institutions are usually reserved for hospitals and educational institutions, but what we saw our businesses do is actually develop further localized supply chains. So they would purchase local food from local restaurants. And I think if we carry on through the slide deck here, and I know to keep this brief, from our experience here in Hawaii, we in working towards these 2030 goals, which are aligned with the Global Sustainable Development Goals. In 2019, we were asked by the United Nations to help scale Hawaii's island economy model in a locally and culturally appropriate way to other island economies. And in so doing, we're now working with over 20 island economies ranging from Bahamas and Ireland to Palau and FSM and RMI and some of our APEC economies around these three ideas of political leadership. So how are we taking more macro level goals that we saw negotiated most recently in Egypt, our climate commitments, but also the sustainable development goals, and have a localized political commitment to achieve that in a way that resonates with the community. And we do these through public-private partnerships, convening our partners and looking for specific areas of intersection, often finding where these goals, the SDGs, have areas of synergies, but also some trade-offs. We measure the progress on the online dashboard I mentioned that we'll put into the chat later, and also focusing specifically on concrete action. And so now if we go to the next slide, this just gives you an indication of how we work with our network, our global island network, through communities of practice. And I heard both Danny and Vincent talk about tourism. So we have 3 communities of practice, and this is in partnership with the US government, the State Department, NOAA, and Department of Energy, and EPA and USAID. We have a community of practice on data for climate resilience, looking at developing online data dashboards and an MOU with Esri on that, looking at clean energy and specifically integrated renewable energy planning. When you look at potential disruption, and in Hawaii, for example, we actually import over 90% of our fuel, which causes a lot of risk actually in the event of a supply chain disruption. So looking at having more renewable energy come online and sustainable and regenerative tourism, which is really an opportunity. One thing I would say, Danny, we'll get into this a little bit in the conversation. Go to the next slide, I think, and that's the final slide I have, but I'll reflect a little bit on the APEC opportunity. This is a map of our islands. What's unique about the Local 2030 Islands Network, it's the first and only peer-to-peer island network focused on SDG implementation, the Sustainable Development Goals. And really the opportunity here is we derive great inspiration and also knowledge from island economies, particularly in the area of sustainability in those communities that have indigenous leadership. And in the case of Hawaii, we're inspired by the 1,000-year history of systems thinking and leadership and sustainability. I think we'll be able to draw from that when the US is convening the informal senior officials meeting here in Hawaii. And the reason being is that we all were looking at the outcome document for the APEC Leadership Summit in Thailand. And one of the things that they've actually put an emphasis on is a circular green economic recovery. And that's very aligned with the philosophy that we have in Hawaii for a biocultural and circular economic and green growth. And so I think you'll see a lot of those themes emerge as we talk about APEC. Delighted to be here. I'll stop there and look forward to engaging in a dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Celeste. And that's wonderful. I mean, just hearing from all 3 of you, lots to really digest, but maybe I can start with and Danny, please, if you have to drop off, don't worry, but maybe I'll bring you back in, Danny. Have you any comebacks? Sure. I don't know if you'll be able to listen to both Vincent and Celeste there. Is there anything you'd like to add, having heard from them? And obviously, your comment at the end on Timor Leste. Interested to hear what you mentioned. Is it going to take an ASEAN pathway, or are they part of the Pacific? Can they not be part of both, or do you see they need to choose because of geopolitical tensions?
Well, it's a question very close to my heart, Michael. And thank you to previous speakers. That's been fascinating to listen to. And what I like about this type of engagement is you can hear people come at quite similar conclusions, activities, and investments from vastly different backgrounds. So that's what's wonderful about the power of these types of discussions. So look, specifically on Timor Leste, as I say, it's close to my heart. I've been working with the government of Timor Leste for the past 4 years on their application for membership to ASEAN. And just go back to history, painful history actually. Timor Leste was a province, an occupied province of Indonesia, which is very much sees itself as a Southeast Asian power. It's 50% of the ASEAN economy, for example. And so Timor Leste was already in ASEAN, but then of course they held a referendum. There was a brief but very intense conflict between the Indonesian occupying government authorities and the liberationists, I guess you would call them. And Timor-Leste gained its independence. Now, since then, they have been really relying heavily on Indonesia to support and leverage their membership back into ASEAN. So there's a strange sort of circle here. But what I've noticed in particular, again, sorry for the analysis in the background, is there's been a difficulty for the government to say, well, where do we find our economic and integration future, maybe even social future? We are essentially a Pacific country. We face both the east of Indonesia, PNG, and Australia, and we look west to Indonesia and north to the rest of Southeast Asia. So they find themselves in a very particular position. And so they actually hedged their bets, to be quite frank. They have both joined the EU's Economic Partnership Agreement in the region. They are working very closely with organizations like PIFS, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat on Development and Integration. But they are also, as I said, very much focused on the opportunity of ASEAN. Remember, ASEAN being the 500+ million people between China and India, it's a very attractive market for expansion and growth. But quite frankly, the economy of Timor-Leste looks more like a Pacific economy. There's an oil and gas, which is funding their sovereign wealth fund, the Petroleum Sovereign Wealth Fund, but they are increasingly having to diversify into commodities like coffee, but also things like coconut and their derivative products. So it looks more like a Pacific economy, and I think that is weighing heavily on the mind of ministers and decision makers. What I say is the opportunity here is, let's not wait for the governments to make decisions about these things. Let's look for complementarities between Pacific economies, particularly Fiji, particularly PNG, and Samoa and Tonga, maybe also Hawaii, and French Polynesia, and let's identify the ways that we can work together. Opportunities for a productive trade, so value-add trade within the region, and then export outside of the region. We don't need to wait until political decision makers have made their decisions. So that's a brief snapshot of the last 5 years of my life.
Thanks, Danny. I can hear your passion, so it's great to hear that. Celeste, can I come back to you and to Vincent, because I'd like to talk about just data as a subject header, because for both of you, it felt, you need, and if you're going to be talking to governments on policy, they want to see the data. And I'm just looking on my other screen here. I brought up the Aloha challenge that you shared in the chat. These dashboards, I mean, it's becoming commonplace now to have a dashboard, whether you're an industry or even a company, to share that cumulatively amongst your staff. Can you just maybe digest, maybe going back to Celeste for a second, where are you getting the data? How do you sort of source it, and how do you verify it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in fact, we were just talking to our data team today. There's no absence of data out there. It's really, how is it curated? Who is the audience, and how is it being used? And it's absolutely essential that we actually measure progress hold ourselves accountable in a really transparent way in order to know where we're going. So in the case that what's unique about the dashboard here with the Local 2030 Islands Network, it's actually community driven. So first thing that we did is you measure what matters, right? So we went into the community to determine what matters to the community. And I think this is a real opportunity, whether you're thinking about SDG implementation, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the NDCs for climate, or even ESG commitments, which a lot of our companies are now looking at very carefully. What are we measuring? How do you get that data? And so a lot of what we're doing here is looking at community-driven approaches and understanding what is unique to a particular local or cultural context. So for example, if you are some of our business forum members here in Hawaii, if you're operating a utility or an airline, to understand that it's a very unique context within which this happens. I see you have the dashboard pulled up here. That's great, Danny. So a couple of things we're doing is we're able to communicate to our partners. So here you actually have the opportunity for people to actually get involved, understand what is actually happening. The way that our dashboard is structured, and again, we have a partnership with Esri on this that is a real leader in geospatial mapping, is we actually have our scorecard, and it's aligned around our 6 priority areas that do roll up to the Global Sustainable Development Goals. And they're tracking our commitments, like how quickly and how are we doing on achieving our 100% clean energy goal, which is a 2045 goal, but we have certain 2030 benchmarks that we need to hit. We also have a commitment to double local food. But when you look at that in an island context, you actually need to be able to weigh the trade-offs between what we have also is a affordable housing crisis. We have ambitions also for natural resource management and our really diverse ecosystem. And so what the dashboard allows us to do is to really closely look at those trade-offs and the synergies where there is alignment, where we can actually have water, energy, and food nexus projects. So I could talk a lot about the dashboard, but what's exciting is that other island economies are developing their dashboard to reflect this. One thing that Danny said too, it resonates with me as a former White House official, that I was actually working in the Obama administration at the White House in the last APEC, and to see this happening at the local level. I think he said that we need to knit better regional and national policy. I think that's the opportunity also with Hawaii hosting the informal senior officials meeting next month, is that you're actually looking at, through the dashboard, we're collecting community level data as well as statewide level data and how that's rolling out nationally and globally. One final thing is, if you do explore the dashboard, you will be able to see you can actually go down to the county level and the individual level. And really what that means is, in order to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change by 2030, which is what the IPCC report tells us, we are going to need widespread behavior change across every sector of our society. And in order to do that, we actually need to be able to be equipped with the tools that we need to change our behavior. And so that's what the localized dashboards actually do.
So that's fantastic. I mean, I was just looking there, and obviously it immediately sort of flags where the priorities need to go to make a big difference in decarbonisation or just reducing emissions in general, whether it's methane or natural gases as well. It's not just about carbon. Sometimes people just lump everything in carbon, but agriculture also is a big problem with its methane emissions as well. Vincent, coming to you then, having seen some of the stuff that they're doing in Hawaii, do you have a sense in French Polynesia and in your education, wearing your educational hat, what are you doing at the academia level to help the island get this sort of digitally enhanced so you can integrate? And if you can, I mean, maybe is there opportunities? Do you see opportunities from where you sit to do more with Hawaii and other islands under these initiatives?
I'm quite impressed with all the data, Celeste, that you presented us. I was browsing your site and I see the rental bicycle use and market visits, etc. Those are very microeconomic, very detailed data that we don't have in French Polynesia. I know the head of the Statistical Institute, but he has not many financial means, basically, to achieve that. However, my little research lab, basically at the university, we invited about 2 weeks ago some of the best experts from the Pacific area, in particular one professor who collects data basically for a dozen islands in the Pacific. And basically it will help us with trying to achieve the same kind of data that you have, but at a low cost, basically. So right now, technology, of course, helps a lot, but I'm quite impressed. What I wanted also to say is that I'm quite enthusiastic about the fact that it's not greenwashing anymore. The governments have basically created that sustainable inclusive tourism strategy that I was talking about, FM27, and the population also agrees. It's not exactly like Hawaii in the sense that the population is 85% Polynesian native, contrary to Hawaii, which is about 20–25%. So there's a whole support towards that. I don't know in Hawaii if there's such a support or not for sustainable tourism, but obviously I've talked to the dean of one of the schools at UH, University of Hawaii, and also some experts on that, and they tell me yes, there's a local support. The population support is quite important, because if not, you won't achieve anything. So I totally agree with your remarks, saying we have to go deep into counties, into cities, into islands, to not just macroeconomic data, but look at very fine data, except of course, it takes a lot of efforts. And of course, that's where we're gonna see if it's gonna work or not. But I totally agree, and we have a lot to learn from Hawaii. So thank you very much for this presentation.
If I could just two-finger there, Michael, thank you so much, Vincent. And I think we would be delighted to work with Tahiti more and your team. I think that the opportunities are tremendous when you look at island alignment. And, you know, one of the things that we have been able to do with Esri is to have the dashboard platform available to our island economy partners at no cost because of the work that's taken place already. But, you know, I have to say that even our initiative, it's all about islands inspiring other islands. And in fact, you know, it was the Caribbean and the Micronesian Challenge, which actually inspired us in Hawaii, the Aloha Plus Challenge. And so I think this is really a story about islands inspiring other islands, really looking at that intersection of community engagement, indigenous knowledge, local wisdom coming to the forefront. This is exactly the type of information that folks that have just spent the last 2 weeks negotiating in Egypt, the climate COP, are looking for, actual implementation. Vincent, to your point on tourism, absolutely. You know, I think prior to COVID, already our community thought that the numbers were really not sustainable. We had very high levels of tourism. Local communities were concerned about natural resource management. And the tourism authority, the Hawaii Tourism Authority, actually prior to COVID, integrated into their 5-year strategic plan sustainability, resilience, and green growth, and actually made a commitment to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals and the Aloha Plus Challenge. So they were actually ahead of the curve. When COVID hit, there was the disruption, absolutely, but we had already been looking at that move towards diversification that you spoke about, which is not easy. But fast forward to where we are right now, what is interesting is through the Local 2030 Islands Network, we have launched a regenerative and sustainable tourism community of practice. That would be great if you were to join. It's supported by NOAA and data that we have from NOAA to actually look at things like marine protected areas, for example. But on this point, one of the things that the community, our members, have actually said they would like is to have community-driven destination management action plans. So the tourism, you know, they have a long history of destination management action plans, but have those been community-driven? And what the Hawaii Tourism Authority managed to do over the last year and a half is to engage every community in trying to figure out what is the future for tourism that they would like to see. And I think that it will be much more robust coming out of this process.
So Danny's had to drop off. So Vincent, back to you. So, I mean, look, it's interactive. Please jump in.
Yes, if I may, I totally agree with you, Celeste. And actually, you may have heard of a practice called Rahui in Tahitian. And basically, Rahui is the fact that the population for decades or centuries have been used to basically get together, agree together without no pressure from any institution, any government, or any king or queen. And basically, they agree to stop fishing for a few months in this area of the lagoon. Now, it doesn't work at all times, in all places. But one of our researchers, Tamato Bambridge, is very famous for having written a book and doing a lot of research on Rahui. And maybe this is this kind of community effort that you're talking about, which is the most successful because the population wants it. And if it's something top-down, which is typically the French way, imposed by some administration, usually it doesn't work that much. So I totally agree with these grassroots efforts. And also the word regenerative tourism, which I've learned a few weeks ago from Pauline Sheldon, a famous researcher in tourism. And she explained to us basically that it's not just about sustainability. It's not about bringing back nature where it was. It's about all the human aspects of basically sustainability and more. And obviously the population has a great role to play. So I totally agree with you.
I'm so delighted you mentioned Pauline, Vincent. Pauline Shelton, the former dean of the Timken School of Tourism in Hawaii, is actually on our board. And she is a huge visionary for regenerative tourism. And I would predict, actually, if I were to say it here, Michael, not first, I think we talked about this at a Brookings meeting. I think the post-SDG development framework might actually be RDGs, regenerative development goals, inspired by islands, actually, because I think island economies have been living in the reality of finite resources all forever. And now when we're looking at, when we look at our broader economy, when our current model of production, consumption, and waste, which we still have, when you had at a much smaller scale relative to, the planet, now that's grown. And so relative to planetary boundaries, it's pushing up against planetary boundaries. So we really need to be thinking about these circular green economy approaches that Thailand's talked about, regenerative tourism. And Vincent, what you mentioned about Raui, it's really exciting because there are those connections. In Hawaii, we talk about the ahupua'a, which was a system of management that was highly sophisticated, and actually Native Hawaiians managed a population comparable to today's population prior to European contact through these sustainable resource management, which was actually so efficient, it was vertical. There wasn't actually even trade in between these different ahupua'a or the moku system. And that's because, to your point, you knew that you don't develop in the area where you have your water supply, but you have very lots of abundance with fish pond development in the lower ahupua'a area. And I think we've seen this in Japan that has the Satoyama, for example. So these really interesting ridge to reef solutions that island economies have, I think the rest of the world can learn from.
And can I just add, I mean, I love that you are not going on the record that it's going to become RDGs, but I like it, so I'm going to adopt it myself. And to add to that, I memean, obviously I've been reading a little bit. I mean, when you talked about Celeste earlier, Thailand, their whole sort of year's theme was on this biocircular green economy. And I guess obviously US with the chair of APEC is going to be taking on some of those tracks as well. I guess for a better word, when it comes to, I guess, putting it into a context, we're talking about circular economy in general, all industries looking at, and I know under the sort of China-US tensions, there was this talk about nearshoring, but actually nearshoring is relevant regardless of tensions. It's actually a solution to some of the reduction in decarbonisation, especially reducing long distance shipping of energy imports, for one. So we have the donut economics that's been around for a decade already, but that's also talking about trying to keep within our boundaries of what and keeping within the finite resources that we have and not going beyond it. So I think there's a narrative that is coming very strong. It's been around for a little while, but I do agree, PBEC now, you've made us think, because we've always been about sustainable economic growth in the region. And both Danny has really called it out earlier in his saying, like, is it growth over equity and a political tool just to try and unite people together? And I would like to sort of put to you both, if we don't talk about growth, how do we frame the narrative so it appeals to the business sector, so they feel like it's not going to damage their bottom line adversely, but actually we're all moving in the same directions, because growth is still banded around and sustainability has never been banded around more than now. But now we're hearing the regenerative phrase, which maybe both of you can go. I mean, I know, Vincent, you've just decided to learn it yourself. Maybe Celeste can divulge a little bit more on that, because I think I would like to understand, what does regenerative mean versus sustainable? I mean, is it just a play on words, or is it actually quite defined? Thanks. Maybe Celeste first.
Yeah, well, many questions in one, Michael. So I trust that, you know, to back it a little bit. So sustainable development, you know, with the Brundtland definition, Brundtland report definition, is really to make sure that you use resources today so you don't undermine the ability for future generations to have sort of a comparable level of prosperity. But, you know, it doesn't take it to the next level. You know, in Hawaii, as a kid growing up in Hawaii, we were always taught to leave the place better than when you found it. And that, you know, is the most simplistic form of regenerative. I think from a child's perspective, you improve it. And that's really what I'm seeing our youth are committed to, even those that we saw so brave at the COP, the youngos getting, you know, formal recognition to provide input into that process. And they see their future prosperity as connected to success of a regenerative model. To your point about businesses, you know, this is really where a lot of the discussion on sustainability is manifested in ESG, right? Environment, social governance. And there is quite a lot of hand wringing actually around ESG by businesses, trying to figure out what does it actually mean. And I think partly the challenge is that a lot of things are getting conflated at the moment. Right. So when you think about ESG, environment, social governance metrics are what institutional investors are looking for when they evaluate a company that they are investing in. And usually what they're looking, though, is for something more narrow. They're looking for a metric that reflects what is very material to that company. You know, for example, if there's a hydropower company, what is the water resources and the management there like? Because that's actually material. And depending on that, then they can evaluate, you know, the investment opportunity. But what's happening over here is we have what we call broader sustainability outcomes. And I think what we're hearing from institutional investors that are focused on ESG, these two are getting conflated and then causing a little bit of confusion. And both are important, though, is what we're hearing. So sustainability outcomes, like wanting more to address climate change and regenerative tourism, these are important. You have ESG metrics that are more narrow, specific. How are we evaluating a company? And hopefully those things come closer together eventually. But ESG is still one of those areas, and there's going to be a different regulatory regime around these things soon to provide more guidance. But we're seeing even institutional investors like BlackRock and Vanguard, for example, making it very clear that they are prioritizing not just the ESG, but also SDGs. And so again, this continues to be a discussion. I think this is where you see, Michael, to your point, regenerative and sustainable for businesses actually playing out in a very specific way.
That's great. Thank you, Celeste, for clearing that up for me. Vincent, over to you.
If I may, I'm going to talk only about what I know, which is sustainable and regenerative tourism. But one example, and sorry to names, is the Brando Hotel, which is in Tetiaroa, a beautiful atoll. Marlon Brando owns or used to own this hotel. And this is one of a kind in the world. It's 100% basically neutral, CO2 neutral. It's very ecological and so on. Of course, it's very expensive. But perhaps the question for us in French Polynesia is we have always been very expensive, a very expensive destination. And instead of basically attracting mass quantities of tourism, now I think it's over. We know that we'll never do that. We have not succeeded anyway. And we look for quality tourism, which means this kind of ecological tourism, cultural sensitive tourism, and regenerative tourism that you're talking about. And finally, I think companies begin to understand that it's also profitable for them, more than the old kind of tourism, mass tourism, and so on. Now, of course, there's still the problem of airfare, and which will become more expensive, basically because of carbon taxes and so on. But we can hope that in the next 20 years, there will be technological advances that basically reduces dramatically or eliminate all those CO2 emissions that we still have basically tourism that can basically bring some prosperity to the island, because without tourism, it's going to be very difficult. So I'm quite optimistic about that. There should be efforts to be made, of course, because it's not going to be free, basically, to go through this transition period. But nevertheless, with all the technological advances, progress, and innovations, plus with a little bit of efforts on the part of the population, which is invested and motivated, I think we can achieve basically a long-term path towards profitable cooperation. And in my opinion, as an economist, the question is, are companies and politicians patient enough to wait for a decade or two for the companies to become profitable again in that new scheme of things? That's I think the question. Or will they be too impatient and drop ESGs because it doesn't make money fast enough? I don't know, honestly, but that's my only worry.
Yeah, I think, Vincent, you're right. And I realize I didn't really answer the question too, Michael, about the timing. I think the current model and the current of growth is that, you know, successful companies will grow, and that's what investors are looking for. So that's really where we're going to have to see the shift of really reframing what prosperity is and how we can look for those synergies, right? And we're seeing a lot of leadership actually at that local level. And I just want to, you know, spotlight a few, because one of the things we actually have here in Hawaii, which I think is quite unique, is the Sustainable Business Forum. And it's a group of 26 CEOs that have come together committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and ESG outcomes and the Aloha Plus Challenge. Some of the things that they're doing, you know, are airlines. It includes Hawaiian Airlines and Alaska Airlines. They've committed to exploring sustainable aviation fuels, for example, and really trying to map out what does that actually look like on the ground. Another interesting commitment and focus of the SBF is looking at supporting the doubling local food goal and looking at having more localized supply chains. I mentioned this earlier. And, you know, Hawaiian Airlines, for example, made a commitment to source 30 to 40% of its food locally. Now, what happens is certainly there are a lot of challenges associated with that. And I don't think we've actually worked through all those challenges, but at least by signaling to the market that they are interested in purchasing this, and they're finding that that actually is a really good business practice. So sometimes when you look at these goals of sustainability and regenerative tourism, as Vincent said, it's not at a no or low cost, at least in the near term, but being able to see a longer term trajectory and note that that's actually what visitors are looking for, and make it very inclusive. That when visitors come to Tahiti or to Hawaii, they can be part of that process. They can see this community is committed to stewarding their place. Come to Tahiti, come to Hawaii, be inspired by islands, go home and steward your place, which will have, you know, which have a much broader positive impact for island economies that are actually experiencing climate impacts already.
I think that is a great way, Celeste, as you say, to inspire. And I think the TikTok generation that we mentioned before offline was, when they do go on these holidays now, I think there's less enthusiasm just to sit on a beach and read a book like I would be very happy to do. They want to be involved in, you know, the local community and understand their challenges, and maybe even participate in something locally to really experience the culture and then bring that back. And typically after a holiday, you do bring something back with you that you've experienced. And what better way than to guilt us all who live in cities to be doing a lot more in recycling and in all of those, and teaching our kids good habits. Because I think if we bring our kids to islands, they're always going to have a great time, because coming from a city to an island, they've got space to run around in. They've got this freedom that they can't enjoy in a city, and they meet islanders as well who have a very typical relaxed persona and less stressful. I mean, I'm not taking anything away. It's stressful for all of us in a post-COVID world with dealing with many issues besides what we're talking about today. But just in general, I think it's a great initiative. It's sort of that destination action plan that you referred to. So we're coming to the end of our session already, and I still feel like we could talk a lot more, but maybe I just quickly ask you both to give a quick 30-second takeaway. What would you like the audience to go away with today, having heard everything? If there's sort of a soundbite or a sort of a call to action Thank you. First, Celeste.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. And I've really enjoyed the conversation with you, Danny and Vincent. You know, I think at the highest level, especially now that we have two other islanders, and actually, Danny, Ireland is a founding member of the local 2030 Islands Network, because Ireland is also an island economy. So when we think about island economies, we're thinking of local, regional, national governments. So Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico, and the United States as a country with islands. And so really the whole idea is how do we make this a much bigger issue so then we can start seeing the outlines of a solution. And what I mean by that is we are all islanders on island Earth. You know, when you think about finite resources and all the things we talked about, the need for a circular economy, regenerative tourism, it's really getting the rest of the world to be inspired by islands and islanders that have actually been at this for quite some time, to really forge a pathway forward very quickly. You know, we have 2030 goals that we really need to be looking towards achieving. And so what I'd leave you with is, you know, if you want to save the world, you need to think like an islander. And that cuts across all kinds of economic growth and green growth and blue economy. It's really comes down to an islander mentality and mindset. Yeah.
Vincent.
I totally agree. Being an islander now for about 15 years, I've changed totally my mindset. I was in favor, of course, of globalization, and it's still a plus, of course. But the situation being what it is, geopolitically, geostrategically, and in terms of our environmental problems, we have to change our mindset. And as the president of French Polynesia stated a few weeks ago, he wants French Polynesia and, of course, other islands to be the leaders, the example for the rest of the world. And we admired Hawaii and Tahiti, obviously, for our marvelous nature and the people also. And so it's not just about sustainability, but regenerative tourism. And of course, we have a serious task to accomplish to be the leader and the example. But I'm confident in the future, and the youth in particular, who is very motivated. Let me conclude with this anecdote. My first class this semester, I asked the student, who are mostly 90% Tahitians, would you prefer to be 200 years ago in Tahiti with no modernity, no internet, no airport, nothing, or today, where you have all those modern aspects to life? And to my surprise, more than half of them say, we want to be back to 2 centuries ago. So that shows that basically the population is inspired, motivated to change. And that brings me a lot of confidence for the future.
Wonderful. So on that note, I just want to thank our panelists today. What a wonderful and diverse conversation on islanders and islands on this finite resource island Earth. I need to get rid of my "in" at the beginning because we're not infinite anymore. Thank you so much. Great to have you on. Good luck to USA on Friday. This is going out 2 days before, but we'll see how they get on in the World Cup, and hopefully we'll see French Polynesia soon. A great result for France last night against Australia. So good luck to everybody in the World Cup this year, and speak to you soon. Stay in touch. All the best, everybody. Great evening ahead.
Thank you very much, Michael.
And aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha.